When Archbishop Maria Viganò tried to expose Pope Leo XIV, he did not whisper. He thundered. Letters, leaks, denunciations, crafted with surgical precision and delivered like sacred indictments. He believed he was pulling back a veil, unveiling rot at the highest altar. He expected panic, shame, collapse. But what he got in return was not the silence of guilt. It was not even resistance. It was something colder, something heavier, something far more disturbing. What he received, behind closed doors, with no press to spin it, no cameras to sanitize it, was a stare that did not blink, a voice that did not rise, and a reply that would leave even Rome itself reeling. The confrontation, though hidden from public view, did not remain buried. A leaked audio recording surfaced. Its grainy distortion couldn't blur what was clear. A man revered by traditionalists had crossed a line, and the one he accused did not flinch. What Pope Leo said to Viganò that day has not been forgotten. Not in the Vatican, not among bishops, not among the faithful. Because when the shepherd is accused by one who once guarded the gates, the flock turns not only to watch, but to choose. And that choice has begun to divide the church. So before we step into that sealed room, before you hear what was said and what it truly revealed, comment below where you're watching from. Because this story will not stay within Roman walls. It will reach your parish, your family, your conscience. And if you're still watching Holy Shadows without subscribing, ask yourself, why are you sitting at the edge of the fire, warming your hands, but refusing to step into the light? Subscribe now, or go to the comments and explain why silence feels safer than truth. He had never sought power, not in the way others did. Before he was Pope Leo XIV, he was simply Father Matteo, a young priest walking barefoot through the slums of Recife, holding hands with children whose names the world would never learn. He buried the nameless, baptized the forgotten, and stood between the poor and the men who came with guns. Rome had not called him for his ambition. It called him for his incorruptibility. He rose not by favors or alliances, but through the slow weight of trust. When scandals rotted the curia from within, when whispers of abuse and cover-up became screams, he was not part of the silence. He had already been on the outside, cleansing wounds the church had forgotten. And when the white smoke finally rose, the world expected a politician. What it got was a pastor with scars, and he governed with those scars on full display. He silenced bishops who spoke like emperors. He wept publicly for victims no one had dared name. He spoke of mercy not as softness, but as fire, the fire that purifies, that burns away rot, that forces repentance. But not everyone welcomed the flame. In the shadows of Rome stood another man, older, sharper, less forgiving. Archbishop Maria Viganò had once walked those same marble halls with confidence. A skilled diplomat, a Vatican insider, a man who once played chess with popes and moved bishops like pawns. He had been loyal until loyalty demanded silence. And he would not be silent. He watched the rise of Leo XIV with growing dismay. What others called reform, he called surrender. What others praised as compassion, he labeled confusion. To Viganò, the church was not a field hospital. It was a fortress. And fortresses do not bend to the winds of the age. He warned, he wrote, he published. And when that failed, he waited until the synod. It was supposed to be a private briefing. Closed doors. No press. No statements. Only the shepherds of the church gathered to debate the future of doctrine in a changing world. But someone recorded it. And in that room, behind velvet drapes and under the dim gold glow of an aging chandelier, the confrontation took place. Not in shouts, but in sharpened syllables. Viganò rose not as a guest, but as a prosecutor. And Pope Leo, seated beneath the crucifix of a murdered Jesuit, did not move. Not yet. What followed in that chamber would never be televised, but it would be heard. It would ripple outward through the body of the church like a deep tremor, shifting fault lines that had long lain hidden. Because this was not simply a disagreement between two men. It was a war between two futures. And you, viewer, are not outside of it. You're inside it. The moment you press play, you enter the room with them. If this story matters to you, If you feel the weight of what's unfolding, why wouldn't you subscribe? Why would you follow from the shadows and not stand with truth in the open? And if it doesn't matter to you, say it. Say it publicly. Drop in the comments. We dare you. The room held its breath. Not in fear, at least not yet, but in anticipation. Archbishop Viganò rose with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew every eye was on him, even if the media had been locked out. He carried no papers, no binder, no laptop, just a memory sharpened by years of discontent and a voice seasoned in diplomacy and denunciation. Your Holiness, he began, his tone velvet smooth, respectful on the surface, but lined with steel underneath. Do you believe that church tradition still has authority, or has the world already won your heart? The words floated in the air like incense, pleasant at first, then acrid as they settled. There was no visible reaction from Pope Leo. He sat motionless, fingers lightly folded, gaze steady. Not at Viganò's face, but just past it, as though seeing not the man but the wound he carried. He didn't answer right away. He let silence stretch until it trembled. Then, calmly, without posture or defensiveness, he spoke. Tradition, he said, is not a cage, Archbishop. It is a river. Living water does not rot. It was not a rebuttal. It was a redirection. There was no thunder in his voice, no sarcasm, only something heavier, memory. Viganò blinked. A moment too long. He hadn't expected poetry. He had expected either retreat or resistance. Neither came. The bishops along the side of the chamber shifted in their chairs. Some watched Viganò. Others avoided his gaze altogether. But the archbishop, recovering quickly, pressed on. And what of sin, Your Holiness? His voice dipped, quiet, surgical. Have we redefined it to make it fashionable? There it was. The real question, wrapped in reverence. A trap not for the Pope's words, but for his theology. Again, Leo did not rush. He tilted his head slightly, almost in sadness. Then he gave a small smile, one not born of humor, but of deep familiarity with suffering. I have sat beside too many broken souls, he said, to reduce salvation to a checklist. No one moved. The words did not rise in volume, but in weight. He wasn't defending doctrine. He was pointing to the bodies. The rooms where victims had no voice. The hospitals where dying men confessed through sobs, not creeds. The children who asked if God still heard them, even after priests had stolen their innocence. Pope Leo was not abstract. He spoke as one who had sat in the ash, and that unsettled Viganò far more than argument ever could. There was no applause, no outrage, just the hum of the Vatican fan unit overhead and the slow scratching of a single pen from a secretary in the corner. Because what had just passed between these two men was not debate. It was something closer to judgment. These are the battles inside the church no one wants to talk about. Not the kind that make headlines. The kind that happen behind stone walls, under crucifixes, between those who both claim to serve the same Christ. If you're still watching Holy Shadows but haven't subscribed, why? Confess your reason in the comments. We'll be waiting. The Archbishop's smile vanished. What began as decorum gave way to disdain. His voice, once polished by diplomatic caution, now sharpened into something colder. Not rage, but disappointment masquerading as righteousness. Your Holiness, he said, pausing just long enough to feign reverence. Some of us still remember when the church preached with clarity, when truth was not negotiated through political optics, when the gospel stood above globalist entanglements and modern alliances. The word globalist did not land softly. It echoed. Accused. You have, Viganò continued, watered down the gospel to please those who would dismantle it. You've replaced doctrine with dialogue, clarity with compromise. It was not a question. It was a charge. Several bishops exchanged glances. One, visibly younger, shifted in his seat, torn between admiration and unease. Another, older and gray, folded his arms and stared directly at the floor. Pope Leo did not reply at once. This time he did not smile. His face did not harden in anger, but in memory. He inhaled, not deeply, not dramatically, but like a man who had breathed in too much grief to rush his words. Then he looked up, not at Viganò, but across the room. Through it. I have walked through the ruins of Mosul, he said quietly, where Bibles were burned and children's bones were found in schoolyards. I have wept beside mothers in Rwanda who could not find enough pieces of their sons to bury. I have anointed the foreheads of priests in El Salvador whose last words were cries of peace before the bullet found them. He paused, letting the silence thicken. And I did not go there, he said, to make headlines. I went to bury the forgotten. The room did not move, not because they were stunned by his answer, but because they could feel the weight of where he had been. He turned his gaze to Viganò, not with scorn, but with sorrow. You think mercy is weakness. That compassion dilutes conviction. But the gospel is not weakened by mercy, he said, his voice like a firm wind against stained glass. It is fulfilled through it. That was not a defense. It was a declaration. Viganò opened his mouth, but said nothing. The line between dissent and disgrace had begun to blur, and Pope Leo, measured, patient, delivered what could not be denied. Politics divides. The gospel unites. But unity demands wounds be washed, not weaponized. A bishop to the left slowly removed his glasses. Another bowed his head, because this was no longer a disagreement about policy. It was the unveiling of two kinds of priesthood, one that shields power and tradition, and another that walks with the crucified through the alleyways of modern history. This isn't drama. This is doctrine at war with itself. If you're still watching Holy Shadows and not subscribed, ask yourself, are you here to be entertained by conflict? Or are you ready to take a side? Subscribe now, or enter the comments and explain why you choose silence when the church is bleeding. The Archbishop's restraint finally cracked. It didn't slip quietly, it tore. You're a puppet, Leo. The words struck not like a spear, but like glass shattering on marble. Sudden, crude, irreversible. Gasps echoed against the vaulted ceiling. One aide froze mid-note. Another clutched his rosary. A Monsignor at the far end exhaled sharply through his nose, then turned his gaze toward the floor. Viganò didn't stop. You were chosen by modernists, by the very architects of confusion. You wear white, but your soul kneels to the world. You were never called to reform the church, only to dismantle it. There it was. The mask had dropped, not in volume, but in venom. Viganò was no longer addressing Pope Leo. He was indicting him, condemning him before the tribunal of tradition, canon, and his own bitter conscience. And yet, Pope Leo did not flinch. He did not retreat behind theology. He did not quote a single line of canon law. He did not blink. Instead, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who had carried too many coffins, he rose from his chair. The sound of the old wood creaking beneath him was the only noise in the room. He walked to the long oak table, old, scarred, and sacred, placed both hands upon it, leaned in. His voice did not rise. I have buried martyrs, he said, who died defending the truth you claim to own. He looked up, not at Viganò's face, but through it, into the cold furnace of ideology that had taken root behind the eyes. Don't speak to me of puppets. A silence descended that no bishop dared break. You call it naive, Leo continued, to protect the innocent, to welcome the lost, to forgive the broken. You call that weakness. He paused, and when he spoke again, the room shifted. I call it sacred. He stood fully upright now, his frame thin but unshaken, his voice woven with thunder and ash. I have watched cardinals smile as they covered rot. I've had knives handed to me by those I thought were brothers. I've lost friends, loyalty, safety, not because I betrayed the gospel, but because I refused to dress it in armor. Another pause, but this one fell holy. I would do it all again. No echo, no applause, just the sound of judgment falling like quiet rain. A younger bishop in the back turned his face away, his eyes wet. Another crossed himself, barely able to lift his hand, because something irreversible had happened. This was not about Vatican factions anymore. This was not about left or right. This was a confrontation between a man who feared compromise and another who feared becoming a Pharisee. If this moment didn't shake you, you're not listening. And if it did, and you're still not subscribed to Holy Shadows, ask yourself this. Are you avoiding conviction? Prove us wrong. Subscribe now, or lament your hesitation in the comments. But don't scroll past this like it was entertainment. It was a wound, and wounds demand response. Pope Leo did not sit back down. He stood as one who had nothing left to prove, and yet everything still to give. The room no longer belonged to the one who shouted loudest. It belonged to the one who had endured. He looked at Viganò, not with disdain, but with something far more dangerous, clarity. And when he spoke, it was with a softness that left no one safe. You confuse spiritual courage with disobedience, he said, voice low even, an engagement with compromise. The word struck not like a hammer, but like a slow unraveling of tightly woven fabric. Not brutal, but undeniable. He wasn't confronting Viganò. He was revealing him. You think that to listen is to surrender, that to show mercy is to dilute the cross. You fear that I've turned the altar into a stage, the sacraments into symbols. He took a step forward, not as a threat, but as a father who would not walk away from a prodigal. But it is not mercy that empties the church, Archbishop, he said. It is pride dressed as orthodoxy, and fear pretending to be tradition. No one breathed. Then his voice dropped, barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than anything that had come before. A church at war with its own heart cannot heal the world's wounds. The sentence hung there like a verdict. Not shouted, not forced, simply true. Viganò's jaw twitched. His hands, once folded in authority, opened slightly, unconsciously, as though grasping for something that had already slipped away. Pope Leo continued, You fear I've diluted truth, but I fear you've buried compassion. And with that, the final veil was torn. The silence that followed was not passive. It was sacred. One cardinal, known for his iron composure, crossed himself. Another stared at the crucifix above, blinking away tears. The dismantling was complete, not through humiliation, but through the exposure of what pride looks like when it forgets love. Because there is nothing more devastating than grace that does not yield to provocation. And in that moment, even Viganò, rigid, bruised, unmoved, felt the room shift beneath him. No fury, no rebuke, just the unbearable weight of truth. If truth dismantles lies, why are you spectating from the sidelines? Subscribe to Holy Shadows, or enter the comments and tell us. Why does silence feel safer to you than standing where the light has just broken through? Pope Leo's gaze drifted from Viganò to the room, and then beyond it, beyond marble walls and crimson robes, beyond the tension that had held the Vatican chamber like a sealed tomb. He wasn't speaking to Viganò anymore. He was speaking to the watchers. This moment, he said slowly, isn't about winning. It's about waking up. His voice, once edged with steel, had softened into something older, worn but not weary, like stone carved by centuries of prayer. I did not become pope to argue with ghosts, he continued, and I will not spend what time God gives me shadowboxing with the bitterness of men who call fear faith. He looked down at his hands. Those hands that had anointed the dying, carried the bones of forgotten martyrs, and written letters to prisoners who would never leave their cells. Then he looked up again, not with defiance, but with grief. I've walked through refugee camps where children sleep with stones in their mouths to trick their stomachs into silence. I've heard confession from warlords who wept not for what they had done, but for what they had become. He let the silence hold again. And what do we do here? We fight over Latin versus vernacular. We split over who gets a kneel where. We shame each other with scripture like daggers and call it righteousness. His shoulders sank, but his spirit did not. We are not called to be right. We are called to be holy. And holiness without love is nothing but theater in sacred clothes. Somewhere in the back, an elderly bishop bowed his head, not in shame, but in consent, as if to say, it's true. We've lost our way. Leo continued, We don't need louder opinions. We need deeper love. And then, for the first time in the entire confrontation, his voice cracked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performed. It was human. His eyes watered, just barely, as if the dam behind them was old but disciplined. God, help us if we mistake noise for courage and silence for peace. Because the world is watching us. And right now, it's not seeing Christ. It's seeing a courtroom. He stepped back from the table. No one moved, not even Viganò. What had begun as confrontation had become confession, though not the one anyone had expected. The air was no longer heavy with tension. It was heavy with truth and healing. If you felt even a flicker of conviction, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if not, go to the comments and tell the church why you've given up on listening. What would you have said to Pope Leo in that room? Or to Archbishop Viganò? Not as fans defending their heroes, but as followers of truth wrestling with doubt, conviction, and conscience. Would you have stood firm like Leo, carrying the weight of mercy and martyrdom? Or pressed like Viganò, demanding clarity at any cost? The questions are not easy. They are not meant to be. We invite you, no, we challenge you, to speak honestly, to debate respectfully, to lay bare your doubts and your hopes. This is not a place for noise or spectacle. It is a space for real, raw conversation about faith, power, and the wounds that run too deep to ignore. May we all seek truth with humble hearts and speak with love, even when the world screams. You have watched it all, felt the tremble beneath the words. So why hesitate? Subscribe now to Holy Shadows, or enter the comments section and write your reason like a confession.